It is October 17th, 2014. I am Nancy Becker at Rutgers University Eagleton Institute of Politics with John Farmer, former Assistant Counsel, Deputy Chief Counsel, and Attorney General for Governor Christy Whitman. We are here today to continue our series of conversations on the Whitman administration for the Center on the American Governor. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Let's start today by asking you to tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to college and law school? And what did you do after law school?
Well, I was born in Jersey City, as my father was. My mother is from Queens in New York. We moved around quite a bit growing up because of my father's job. He was a reporter for the Newark News and then the Philadelphia Bulletin, and ultimately for a Newhouse newspaper as a columnist for the Star Ledger. So we first 5 years in Jersey City, and then we moved to Hamilton Township outside of Trenton because he was transferred to cover the governor, Governor Hughes at the time. And then a few years later we moved to Fairfax, Virginia, and he had been transferred down to Washington and was the White House correspondent first for the Newark News, and then that paper folded because of union strife, and then for the Philadelphia Bulletin. So he was the Bulletin's White House correspondent for a few years, and then he was named city editor of the Bulletin, and we moved up to where my parents still live outside of Philadelphia. So I went to Georgetown University undergraduate, Georgetown University Law School, and loved living in Washington and loved Georgetown in both schools, mostly undergrad. Law school was a bit of a grind, as it is for everybody. After law school, I clerked for Justice Handler on the New Jersey State Supreme Court for 2 terms, and in both terms I was specialized in the capital cases. The death penalty had been enacted under Governor Kane, and the first cases were sort of coming to the surface. So I reviewed almost 30 cases in the two years, in addition to the work I did for Justice Handler. Following that, I went to work for Riker Danzig as an associate for a couple of years, where I met John Sheridan, among other luminaries. It was a great place to be. They had Bill Hyland, who'd been the Attorney General under Governor Byrne, and Nick Katzenbach, who'd been the U.S. Attorney General. So it's tremendously heady atmosphere at Riker in those days. And during that period, I worked for Sam Moulthrop, who had come to Riker from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he helped me get into the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I was for almost 4 years, until I went to work for Governor Whitman.
So tell us, you've told us about your parents. Tell us a little bit, did you have any siblings?
I have 3 sisters, all of whom are married, all of whom had children. I've not been blessed with children myself, but and they all live in this, basically in this area. One lives in Pennsylvania, the other 2 live in New Jersey.
And do they also have careers? Are they attorneys or?
My older sister is I guess, semi-retired opera singer. She went to Curtis School of Music in Philadelphia, and worked as an opera singer for several years, and then switched to cabaret singing, and now she does that and teaches voice. My other 2 sisters both went to the University of Delaware and majored in business, and they were both in business until they had their children, and they've been raising them since.
So interesting. So what was your first interest in politics? I mean, clearly out of law school, you clerked, and then you worked for a prominent law firm that clearly people had been involved in politics. So what was your first interest in politics?
I think it came from almost by osmosis from growing up in my household. My father was a reporter who covered politics, and I think one of the reasons I've never been a declared party member is his influence. He taught me very early on that both parties have limitations, and they also have great aspects to them. And growing up in that kind of atmosphere where your father's covering these things, talking about them all the time, it can't help but spark some interest. But it also, as I say, it led me to shy away from joining any particular party.
The other theme that I picked up, and maybe because it resonated with me, I noticed that you majored in English. You have a bachelor's in English. And so the whole theme of writing, which I want to get to as we're talking this morning, clearly goes through your entire career as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's been an interest of mine throughout my life. And again, I think it stems from the admiration I had for my dad growing up.
It's great. He certainly is a well-recognized expert and reporter in New Jersey. So when and how did you meet Christy Whitman?
So I think my career has been somewhat of an accident, the trajectory of it, to the extent that it's had one. I had really not been involved in partisan politics in any way. But I had a circumstance in my life that happened in February 21st, 1993. My wife died. And I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time. Mike Chertoff was the U.S. Attorney. He was great. Paul Fishman was the first assistant. They were both great. They gave me time to sort of deal with things. That year, from 1993 to 94, was really rather a blur for me. So the election happened. I wasn't paying attention at all. I mean, I was aware that Governor Whitman won. It was the farthest thing from my mind to care about those things at that point. But I worked with a guy in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Bob Mintz, who had been an assistant counsel under Governor Kane. And I think it was almost on the anniversary. I had lunch with him, and he asked, "How are things going?" And I said, I feel like I'm kind of stuck. I've given it a year. Things aren't really changing that much. I was feeling exhausted, which is what the lasting effect of grief for me anyway was just being tired. And also it's a very sort of closed world, the U.S. Attorney world. It's, you know everybody you're dealing with. You know the judges, you know the other U.S. attorneys, you know the defense bar. And so, and everybody knew what had happened, and after a while you get tired of people feeling sorry for you, and you want to be in a different place. So I sort of talked to Bob about that, and Bob's wife, Janice, who he had met during the Kane administration, had joined the Whitman administration and was, I'm going to get the titles, I think senior associate counsel, and Peter Venero was the chief counsel, Mike Torpy was the deputy, she was the senior associate counsel. And Bob says, "Well, why don't you go to work for Governor Whitman?" And I said, "Well, I'm not a Republican. That's one reason. I don't know anything about the Trenton world, other than looking at it, from afar from the U.S. Attorney's Office, where, frankly, the culture was very judgmental of politics. I mean, under Florio, the chief of staff had been indicted federally, and so there was this sort of stay away from this world attitude. But Bob was very adamant that it doesn't have to be that way. And I went down and talked to Janice and talked to Peter, and I got to say hi to Governor Whitman, and I told them, this is really great, but I'm not a Republican, and honestly, probably for the last time, or I hope not the last time, but she didn't care. She really didn't care. And they extended the offer, and I joined the administration. So it's a bit of an accident, but it's one that has shaped the whole rest of my life.
So your mentors were Janice and Bob Mintz.
Yes.
And then I guess Peter Venero coming in, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yep.
So clearly you've already told me you did not work on her first campaign.
No.
Did you work on her second campaign at all?
Yes. By the time of her second campaign, I'd been assistant counsel, and I think at the time I was deputy chief. Mike Torpy was counsel during the campaign, and Harriet Derman was the chief of staff. And I was kind of in charge of making sure that everything was kept separate the way it has to be. So I know people thought I was kind of a pain in the neck, but yes, people could work on the campaign, but they had to go to the Republican office to do it. They couldn't do it on state time, and it's rather an artificial dance, but it's necessary. But I did. That's the only campaign I've really ever worked on, was her re-election campaign.
So one of the questions I was going to ask you, but I think that you've already answered it, you were not involved in the Ed Rollins controversy at all.
I was barely aware that it had.
I
tell you how I was aware it happened. Was I was up in Newark. My office was 2 doors down from Mike Chertoff's, and when that was going on, Debbie Poritz came up to talk to Chertoff with Sam Moulthrop, who I used to know, and the two of them were in my office talking to me before they went. And that was the only real involvement I had in the Ed Rollins thing, was from the standpoint of the federal prosecutor's office.
Interesting. So you were pretty young when you were first hired as assistant counsel. How old were you?
How old was I? Let's see, 94, I was 34.
And who hired you ultimately?
It was Peter Venero who hired me, and I had met Peter over the years. He had clerked for Justice Clifford, and I was an adoptee clerk of Clifford. We used to go out, he and his former clerks, and I had done some work on some of his cases, and so I was invited to go along. So I had met Peter, didn't know him well, but we were acquainted with each other, and as I say, they were kind enough to extend the offer.
And what were your responsibilities then initially as assistant counsel?
My initial responsibilities were the Board of Public Utilities, which I knew nothing about. Some of the criminal law issues that came up. Community affairs, that's how I met Harriet Derman, how I met my future wife, Beth Gates, and judicial appointments. That was my initial. And I started, my first day, I believe, or second day, is when the Edison pipeline blew up. So having BPU as a responsibility got my attention very quickly.
And who did you work with at the BPU at that time?
Herb Tate, predominantly. Ted Brown also was his chief of staff. Mm-hmm. I worked with both of them, and it was a very dynamic time in the utility world. There were efforts underway to deregulate electric and water, and so there's a lot of discussion going on, and really the agenda was being driven federally by FERC, and so everyone had to sort of align with where they were headed, and so that was a large part of much more of my agenda than I would have guessed going in was BPU.
BPU. And there were several other assistant counsels who were working on that with you at the time, or did they come in after you?
We were still staffing up because it was fairly early in administration. So I guess I arrived in March of '94, and I think we were not fully staffed till maybe July. So people were coming on board from various backgrounds. It was a really good group of people, and Mike Torpy was sort of the lead on legislation, and every governor's office is configured differently. I've learned that over the years, but in Whitman administration, I think in Kane too, the chief counsel's office had enormous responsibilities. We were responsible for essentially negotiating the budget, and we were responsible for shepherding bills through the legislature and most of that interaction. And I think Brendan Byrne is the one who said, your first year, no one knows what they're doing. I mean, it was a learning process. It truly was. And the fear of having the cabinet get out of control, or people testifying on bills when they weren't supposed to, or just rogue elements of the administration, made it a very tense atmosphere that first spring. I remember Mike Torpy used to tell me how much his hair hurt every day, just from the strain of dealing with, because he really had the lead.
Yeah, what's interesting from our perspective in looking at different governors and how their administrations worked is that both governors Kane and Whitman trusted their staff to make good decisions ultimately. Yes. And it was a different way of managing than other governors who felt they needed to exert more control from the governor's office down.
Governor Whitman, once she trusted you, you got a lot of room to run, and she never cut your legs out. Not once did I feel like I had been exposed and she had pulled the rug out from under me, and frankly, not once did I ever feel that I was put in any kind of compromising position by her. I think one of her strengths, and she had many, was her integrity, and it was evident in all the positive ways. I think there was not one cabinet member indicted, and that's some kind of record in New Jersey. But the tone was set at the top, and the other side of that coin was that people would say we didn't quote get it, and getting it meant we weren't willing to do things that other people may have been willing to do, and we took a lot of flack for that. And
the interesting thing also about her, when you talk about your responsibilities at the BPU, I mean, she had been the head of the BPU, so she probably had a greiter understanding.
She certainly knew more than I did, at least at the beginning. And as I say, it was almost instantly a crisis atmosphere. And I think my second day I had to go up to Newark, and we had a press conference, and I'm thinking, Okay, I'm gonna figure this out. But right now, we created a task force, sua sponte, that on the spot, because we had to do something to address this issue, and we ended up passing the one-call legislation, which became a model around the country, and she was integrally involved in that. She knew those issues cold.
Yeah. So then you were promoted to deputy chief counsel. Now, how did that happen, and how did your responsibilities change?
Well, deputy chief counsel. So as you sort of ascend, and this is true in any organization, you have to learn to let go of the things that you're most comfortable doing. So deputy chief, I was really responsible for sort of the internal workings of counsel's office, and not so much for individual departments. I would deal a lot with cabinet members. The assistant counsel would really be responsible for issue-specific items, and my responsibility really was to make sure the trains ran on time. Mike, who was the chief counsel at the time, Mike Torpy, the two of us were really a great team, I think. I was responsible for, when the bill comments were written, and I had the advantage in all of these things of having been started at a lower place, so I understood the trenches by the time I started to, so I knew things that I would want to do differently, which aren't always obvious if you start at the top, and that's just the truth. But I wanted to know where the bill came from. And don't just tell me what it's about. I can read the bill. My guidance to the staff was, where is this coming from? Who wants this? And why do they want it? And is it good public policy? And so I focused a lot on doing that kind of research. Ended up going to caucus a lot, I hadn't really done that as an assistant counsel. And that first day in the Senate caucus room was something I'll never forget. People running around the table, total chaos. Senate President DeFrancesco sitting in the middle of it, just sort of, saying, well, how am I supposed to control these guys? And started at that point developing relationships with legislators that served me well as I became chief counsel, and ultimately as Attorney General.
So in your responsibilities with the legislature, Governor Whitman's reputation, and it depends on who was saying it, was that she had difficulty working with the legislature.
That's true.
So just describe it, or tell us why that situation.
That was one of the mysteries that I wanted to resolve in my own mind when I got to that level, was why are we having so much trouble dealing with these people? And because there were frictions. There were articles written about Whitman doesn't get it, and I forget who it was, but someone said there's no Monty Hall in that administration. No one wants to make a deal. And part of that was her high-mindedness. And just to give you an example, on judges and prosecutors, she basically said they're going to be evaluated on their own merits and they're not going to be linked. Well, the problem with that is that's great as long as both sides agree nothing's linked. Once one side links them, it's awfully hard to play that game, and it creates tension when you go to them and say, I know you want this shade tree commissioner, but that's a separate issue from this judge, and that's not the way people think, and so that accounted for some of the tension. So what I did to try to understand why this was the case is I went to everybody's district office and met with them there, and I found that was very useful because they're more comfortable. You're on their turf. You're actually making the effort to understand where they're coming from, and you gain goodwill making the effort to do that, and you learn what the dynamics of the district are and why certain issues resonate with people that has nothing to do with party affiliation. It has to do with the demographics of their district. And you also have funny instances. I met with a very senior, I won't name him, very senior senator from South Jersey, and he was saying to me, I was saying, you're my political education. Tell me what the state's about. So I said, well, you have to remember, in New Jersey, you have to remember the 3 E's. Environment, education, and jobs. It's just, and they all have, you develop a tremendous respect for what they have to do. And that's not something that looking from the outside, people really have. And they get, the same way Congress does, they get bashed, and they're easy targets, and everybody beats them up. They have a hard job, and it's hard to run every 2 years. But what I came to learn in doing this is there was a context to this thing, which was that, 2 years before Governor Whitman came in and ran for governor, the Republicans had taken the legislature back. And they not only had done that, but they had overridden Governor Florida's veto of their budget. So they were running Trenton the last 2 years of the Florida administration. Chuck Atayan and Don Francesco were in charge. And she was not the favorite candidate of those guys. They really liked Carrie Edwards. That's the person they really wanted. She was an outsider. She was a woman. She was rich. All of those things, I think, played a role. It may have just been psychological, but they had an attitude toward her coming in that she was a necessary evil. And, and people have tried to sort of paper that over, but it's the truth. And there's nothing, that's not to denigrate them. I understand where they're coming from. And I think that's really the key to the whole thing, because, she had the attitude that I'm the governor and I'm the head of the Republican Party now. And, I deserve a little more deference than I'm being given. And so there was a lot of tension. But on the other side of that, they did pretty much everything that she wanted them to do. So ultimately, it worked. Right. Were there ruffled feathers? Yes. Chuck Atayan was the critical person. He was of all of them the one who embraced her the most completely and said, "She's our governor. I'm going to do what she says." And he was ruling with an iron fist. And so the early years were aided greatly by his presence. And the Senate president, I think he had less of that than others, that attitude toward the governor. But the fact was that he really was in charge in Trenton before she got there. And I think some of that hangover lasted and became an obstacle to getting things done. But they got done anyway.
It's very interesting. So then you were promoted to chief counsel.
Yes.
Now, what were the circumstances that led to those changes, or that change?
So this was after the election. It was a narrow election for a lot of reasons, which we can get into. Mainly because there was a third party and the partial birth abortion bill was foisted upon her. I think I have differences of opinion with various people from the administration. I think it was one of her finest moments, and she did not absolutely veto that bill. What she did was, and I know because I wrote the message, she conditionally vetoed. She rewrote the statute so that we would have restrictions on abortion in accordance with the state of the law, and it tells you everything about that issue. That not only did they override the veto, and then as everybody predicted they would, they lost in court, and Judge Barry in the Third Circuit wrote an opinion that it was unconstitutional, but they never tried to pass a constitutional statute. They haven't since. So what does that tell you? But that fueled the candidacy of Murray Sabrin, the third party candidate, who got, I think, 5% of the vote, and it was predominantly Republican votes, so the election would not have been close but for that issue. But in the wake of that election, Harriet Durman went to the bench. She was the chief of staff, and Mike Torpy became chief of staff, and the governor asked me to be chief counsel. So that's how that happened.
That's how it happened, right? And I was going to actually ask you about
that's one of the
partial birth abortion as one of the most controversial issues. So we understand that you were involved in most of the tough controversial issues faced by the Whitman administration, such as, and I'm going to list them, and then I'd like to talk about them one at a time. So school funding, racial profiling. We just talked about prohibiting late-term abortions,
Yes.
and I also agree it was one of her finest hours. Creation of the Office of Inspector General. So let's take these issues one at a time, as you did partial birth abortion, and just go through them, because they were really critical issues, controversial issues for her. So school funding, let's start with that.
Well, school funding is interesting, because I think I'm the answer to a trivia question on the Abbott cases, because I've been on both sides. When when I was at Riker Danzig, I helped, I co-authored a brief on behalf of the League of Women Voters advocating the position that there should be parity in funding between the avid districts and the other districts and the wealthy districts in the state. And that was the issue at the time. And fast forward to the late 90s, and it had gone way beyond that. And the issue in the late 90s was, you know, there had been parity in funding. They had ordered it. It had existed for a number of years. It wasn't really working. And so the issue is, okay, are those districts entitled to more than parity in funding? And the Whitman administration took the position that parity in funding is really where you have to draw the line, because at some point you're going to disadvantage all the schools in the middle, and you're going to basically lose control of the state budget. And that's been, you know, for those who object to the Abbott decisions, I think that's the reason. It from the governor's standpoint, from the governor's viewpoint, it basically causes her to lose control of the state budget. You don't know what it's going to be. You don't know, and you're at the mercy of whatever the wealthy districts decide to spend. And there's an irrational element to that. So we were involved. I was involved both as chief counsel, and then later I argued one of the Abbott cases as attorney general, and when those were the issues. And the court, you know, went beyond parity in funding and ordered school construction, ordered preschool, and they're all very laudable as a matter of policy, things that should be supported. But the question is, when you do that in a vacuum, what's the effect on the rest of the state? How has it affected the money that we spend on higher ed? How has it affected the money that we spend on everything else? And that's really where, when I argued in front of the Supreme Court, I basically made the pitch that, you know, we have to get this out of litigation, because once it's viewed as an isolated issue, you can't solve it. Because it's more than about money going to the classroom. Because the reason there's been no progress, and now I'm editorializing here, but the reason there's been so little progress, I think, is that you can't view education in an isolated way, the way that litigation causes you to. It's part of a much larger social problem in these cities. And that has gone neglected, I think, because so much of the money's gone on just one thing. So that was school funding. And so, I thought the governor, you know, did the right thing. The court ruled the way it did, and she put the weight of her office behind providing funds for preschool and for school construction, and I think it was the right thing to do.
So let's talk about racial profiling, and we've talked to Peter Venero a little bit about it as well. It was a very controversial issue.
Yes, and really started to come. Well, as Peter famously said, it crystallized when the Turnpike shooting occurred, and that's true. But there were problems. Anyone who drove in New Jersey, I mean, really, you know, knew that there was something going on. But what was difficult from the standpoint of Chief Justice Ports when she was the Attorney General, and Peter when he was the Attorney General, not as difficult for me, because frankly it blew up right as I was arriving, so I had no choice but to deal with it. It was there. You're in a difficult position as Attorney General. On the one hand, your client is the state police. You work with state police solving crimes. You represent them when they're sued. So they're your client. On the other hand, you have responsibility for the uniform enforcement of the laws of the state. And when you had this situation, which was not blatant, Mississippi-style discrimination going on, but it was disparate law enforcement. It's a hard issue to spot before it's too late. And we had litigation going on throughout the 90s that started actually under the Florida administration, the Soto case, where they focused on disparate stop numbers. And we were litigating that case, and we were defending the state police, and the studies they were using to prove this were flawed. But I think the fact that we were litigating and in that mode prevented us from sort of looking at the bigger picture and saying, well, wait a minute, what is going on? And then after the Turnpike shooting, we were forced to confront the fact that we had to look deeper, and Peter started that work. And what they found was it wasn't the stop numbers, it was the consent to search numbers where you really saw the disparate impact. And there was one trooper who basically, several-month period, had done 30 consent searches, and basically they were all Hispanic drivers, and he hadn't found anything. So at what point, I asked, at what point do you realize maybe you're looking at the wrong things? You're 0 for 30 guy, So the issue festered and it blew up, and it occupied most of my time, or not most of it, but a disproportionate amount of my time as Attorney General, trying to fix this, negotiating with the Justice Department, and sort of being caught between the Black Ministers Council, who on the one hand would say you were defending racists, and law enforcement who would say you were betraying them. Very difficult situation to be in. And all you could do was the right thing, because when you're caught like that, there's no winning that issue.
And the governor certainly was criticized strongly in the press for her. She was personally during that time.
Which I just don't think that's fair. I never thought that was fair, because is she ultimately responsible? Yes, but that's really the responsibility of the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General in this state is probably more powerful than any Attorney General in the country. And we're modeled on the federal relationship between the President and the Attorney General, and the law enforcement is under your plenary authority. So, that's where the responsibility lay. And the governor, ultimately responsible because she's the governor, yes, but the idea that she would have, micromanaged law enforcement and have gotten into those kind of weeds, just ridiculous.
Were there any other controversial issues that you were involved in that sort of rose to the level of the ones we've already discussed?
Well, the one that I have probably the most regrets about was the pension bond issue that came up her election year. And I don't think there's an expression when you're trying cases, if you're explaining, you're losing. That idea was not a bad idea, but it was almost impossible to explain it. And subsequent administrations have frankly used it to explain the inactivity on the unfunded liability in the pension system today. Absolutely untrue. Not one penny of today's unfunded liability is from the Whitman years. The pension bond, I'm going to, go in a little bit of detail of this because it's
please do.
It's been such it's a hard one for the governor because it's hurt her legacy as a fiscally responsible governor. So it wasn't as if that was new debt. We were paying. It was an unfunded liability. It existed. It was a debt. We were paying it, and we were paying it at a rate of about 8%, 8-point-something percent interest per year on this unfunded liability. What the pension bonds allowed us to do was fully fund the pension system at a lower interest rate than we had been paying. Now, you could say what it did was it made it a real debt, and it could have changed. It could have changed only if the legislature had taken benefits away. That's not happening. I mean, that may happen now, but it was not going to happen back then. So it was not a crazy idea. It actually saved the state money, and they fully funded the pensions. The unfunded liability of today was created starting under Governor DeFrancesco after she had left. When they changed the denominator of the pension, the retirement age was lowered, and then subsequent governors also added to the pot. There is an SEC investigation of the state of New Jersey that was published in 2009 that everybody should read, because what that investigation concluded was that the state, starting in 2002, basically misled the public in its bond offerings about the unfunded liability. And it became very convenient to say, oh, that was Christy Whitman did that with the pension bonds. Absolutely not true. But again, hard to explain when people are hitting with slogans with the facts. So if you have the situation you have now, and they're paying an unfunded liability, they haven't been paying an unfunded liability, it's been growing for over a decade, and various governors have avoided paying it, and they keep starting the clock at 1. If you hadn't had this experience and someone came to you and said, you could refinance this entire pension debt for 2% and you're paying 7%, what would you do? Not such a crazy idea. Now it's impossibly politically to do it because it's been discredited politically. But it was not, I guess my biggest regret about it wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary. I mean,
And it certainly was not, it was so difficult to explain that it wasn't explained clearly.
yes, Brian Clymer and I went around the state explaining this to legislators. That's one of the reasons it got passed, is if you really sat them down, and we sat down with the unions, they understood it. The NJEA supported it, I believe. But to anyone who wanted to demagogue it, it was so easy. And it was not necessary. And basically, it was the way that people said that the 30% tax cut didn't work. It didn't work because she had to do this. Well, she didn't have to do it. It was an attractive fiscal idea. It got all kinds of awards. Other states did it. But it's being blamed for things that it really didn't cause. You could say, as a matter of policy, was it a good idea to lock in that debt as opposed to just treating it as an unfunded liability? Yeah, bad idea. But they're not going to withdraw benefits. I mean, so as long as that's the case, it was not a crazy thing to do. But I regret the fact that we were not more effective in explaining it.
Interesting. Would you also talk about the creation of the Office of Inspector General, which occurred, did it occur, I don't know if it occurred when you were General Counsel or Attorney General?
Attorney General. Yeah, Attorney General. That was one of the challenges of going from the governor's office to Attorney General, and I've said this to every Attorney General since, I guess, who's talked to me about it, is, it's a different relationship that you have with the governor, and it doesn't really matter how close your relationship was as chief counsel. It's a different perspective as Attorney General. And I'll never forget, maybe I was there 2 weeks, and there was something that I was on the phone with Mike Torpey about, and I basically said, you can't do that. And there was this long pause, and that was the moment when you sort of felt that separation. But there was, I forget it was the thought that maybe racial profiling would not have metastasized the way it did if we'd had something that was sort of freestanding, still within the AG's office, but his mandate was not to criminally prosecute, criminal corruption, but to look for abusive practices, and it's a good government kind of idea, and it was coming toward one of my budget hearings, and my strategy after watching these hearings for years was, frankly, to surprise them. And so every year I had to testify, I tried to make news. I would announce something because they wouldn't be ready. They would be thrown off. Their questions wouldn't make sense anymore, and it worked like a charm every time. So about a week before, I had been thinking about this. We had a senior staff retreat on this issue and decided to do it, and I had the authority as Attorney General to do it. And about a week before, I talked to Mike and told him this was coming, and the governor was fully supportive of this. And then of course one of the first things we looked at was something in DEP, and then everybody was mad. but we didn't have a public advocate, and that was one of the things that was eliminated. And its various parts were still functioning, but it wasn't a department. And I thought this could have this could fill part of the legitimate function that office had, and that was missing.
So you became Attorney General in 1999.
June 1999.
And so tell us about the circumstances that made that happen, and then I want to talk a little bit about your role as Attorney General.
Well, that was, again, sort of an accident in a way. I think it was Justice Pollock called and said he had decided to leave the bench, and he was going to go to Riker Danzig. And we had been looking. We had a short list of people for the state Supreme Court, and Peter Venero was on it. He was probably the closest advisor to the governor, and there is a storied history of governors putting people like that on the Supreme Court. And Brendan Byrne had three of his chief counsels on the state Supreme Court, so that gave us no pause at all. In fact, I think you need people on the state Supreme Court who understand how things work. I think one of the reasons that court tends to look askance somewhat at legislative history is because so many people have been there and know that they may be worded this way, but you know how those words come about. Sometimes it's on the back of a napkin. So you have to look at more than just the specific words. so the governor decided on Peter, and then asked me to be the Attorney General. And I could honestly tell her I never in my career ever would have wanted to be chief counsel. That's a hard job. That's probably the hardest job I've ever had, I think. But Attorney General is something every lawyer would love a shot at doing, because you can really make a difference in that job. And so that's how that happened.
And what were the major issues you worked on then, in addition to Inspector General, and what were your most significant challenges?
Major issue and the most significant challenge was obviously the racial profiling issue and the reform of state police practices. It extended beyond just traffic stops. There was a resistance to accountability, I would say, in the organization, and they have legitimate concerns about being made the subject of, being the whipping boy for the press, but they had resisted modernization. A lot of the records were being kept in paper files. They had a very poor history of recruiting women and minorities, and we were being sued, not just by the Justice Department, by other entities. With respect to those practices, we had to find a new superintendent after the governor asked Carl Williams to resign. So that was, for the first few months, that was pretty much all-consuming for me. I mean, getting those things on somewhat of a track. And as I say, I was meeting regularly with, both on and off the record, with Black Ministers Council, the state police unions, other law enforcement agencies around the state, having to assure them that I was not selling them out, and very tough balance to strike. In fact, an impossible one. But as I say, time is your friend in those situations if you're doing the right thing. And so that was a major issue. We also we pioneered the use of cameras in police cars, and computerization of police cars, all with the idea that it's accountability that matters. And I think the issues are still there around the country, and if the police put up a wall, public trust erodes, and 9 times out of 10, or 99 out of 100, that kind of objective evidence will vindicate the police and what they do. And there was tremendous resistance to all of this, to cameras in the cars, to computerization of the records, to everything. We also reformed eyewitness identification. We were the first state in the country to require sequential as opposed to just a photo array. It was based on good social science. Again, tremendous resistance, and it's all dissipated because it works. It vindicates law enforcement more often than not, and that's what they've come to see. So Megan's Law is also an issue. I argued that in the Third Circuit, and again, they upheld it. Again, a difficult civil liberties issue. And we were confronted with a sort of parade of horribles about what would happen to people whose names were shared, and again, it didn't really happen. I mean, people are responsible, and you have to, at some level, you have to trust adults to be adults, and for the most part, I think we've been vindicated on that score too. Other issues in the Attorney General's office is a very, very difficult environment. You have 10,000 employees, $1 billion budget. You have 700 lawyers and 3,000 troopers. So
huge responsibility.
Huge responsibility, and I have to say they did phenomenal work. The professional staff in Division of Law and Criminal Justice are just the unsung heroes of state government. There's not an issue that arises that doesn't impact the AG's office in some way, and they have a cadre of really dedicated people who certainly aren't doing it for the money, and they're certainly not 9 to 5, and they just do it because they're dedicated to the state, and they don't get enough recognition.
So you continued to serve as Attorney General after Governor Whitman resigned to join the EPA.
Yes.
And did your role or responsibilities change under Acting Governor DeFrancesco?
Not really. When that change happened, I called when she left and Governor DeFrancesco was taking over. I did call him and offer to resign. I thought, we had not always gotten along famously, and we were not enemies. But there's inevitable, especially when I was chief counsel, and and the relationship was what it was, I was the one frequently at odds with them. And so I wanted to let him know that if he was not comfortable with me as Attorney General, I was happy to step aside. But he was great. And he said no, he didn't. He wanted continuity, and that was important. And it really didn't change that much. What the event that happened while he was governor was 9/11, of course. And that's close quarters, and whatever differences we had, he did a phenomenal job, I thought, unrecognized because obviously Mayor Giuliani was front and center, but for the state of New Jersey, I think he was a tremendously calming influence, and we learned a lot on the fly about working together. And his placement of Lillian Barone as the liaison, she was from the Port Authority, as a liaison with the victims' families was tremendous. She was indispensable to the effort that we made. And he was very respectful of law enforcement's imperatives and never tried to meddle, never tried to get involved, never wanted to know. Again, it's the same thing with Governor Whitman. I had the same talk with both of them. I'm not going to tell you about pending criminal investigations. You don't want to know. You want to be able to say, we don't talk about these things. It's a very valuable conversation to have. Similar to one I had, frankly, with my father when I joined the administration. I called and told him I was going to, and he just, there was like dead silence. And he said, well, two things. One, in that fishbowl, you could get fired any day. Something will go wrong. Something always does go wrong, and people get scapegoated. Didn't happen with Governor Whitman. I have to say, I can't think of someone a lower level person who was blamed and scapegoated for something and kicked out. But I did approach it with that in mind, and the reason for this anecdote is the other thing we agreed that day was I would not talk to my father about anything going on because I would be the first suspect if there were leaks, and I wanted to be able to say we don't talk about that, and we've honored that throughout. So
that's great.
It makes it awkward sometimes.
Yeah.
How's it going? It's good. But it's a good rule to have, and it greatly aided me to be able to say, because things do get leaked, and if they get leaked to the ledger, and that's where your father works, obviously and I could legitimately say to them, I don't talk to him about this at all, and it was an absolute wall. So
let's talk a little bit about Governor Whitman's strengths. What, from your perspective, were her greatest strengths?
I think her integrity. As I say, I came with a certain image of Trenton that was a consequence of looking at what happened before. Didn't see that at all, and the tone was set by her. I mean, she is. She's the only governor that I know that I could have worked for. I'll put it that way. And I've gotten to know several of them since. But she had tremendous integrity. She did not put her staff in compromising positions where their integrity would be called into question. She backed you up. If she empowered you to do something and you made a decision, she backed you up. When we were negotiating electric deregulation and the bill stalled on the Senate floor, and it was the typical thing where they said, we have 19 votes. And I'd say, well, you need 21. And they'd say, you have to get it. And I basically, we had a huge fight on the floor, the Senate President and I basically said, no. This is a bill the industry wants. This is a bill that you guys want. She'll sign it. We'll support it. I'm not doing a thing to get these votes. And we had this big thing, and it died that night. And I went back, and she said, what happened? I said, the bill's dead. And I could tell she was a little taken aback. And I said, well, Governor, this is not our fight. We should not have to we shouldn't have to give one shade tree commissioner to somebody to get this done. It's not our problem. And 2 weeks later, it got done. But she backed me. And they were mad at me, and they were, and that was the kind of backing that you had, and the kind of freedom to act that she gave you. And so those are tremendous strengths of hers. And her compassion, I think most of the country, if they knew where she stood on issues, would be Christy Whitman people and Tom Kane people. That's where most of the country is. The two parties are nowhere near either one of them, and that's a shame. But those are, I think, her great strengths.
What were her greatest weaknesses?
Well, I think the relationship with the legislature never really got fixed. And and that was hard and unfortunate. You know, when I became chief counsel, I got her to agree to have dinners, you know, and you know, and it was, you know, it was, they were fine, but nothing, they didn't achieve what I wanted them to. Attitudes were already hardened at that point, and you know, she had, Jack Collins was a very, very strong personality as speaker, had his own agenda, and her relationship with Donnie was never terrible, but there was tension. But with Jack, it wasn't really. There was. I think she believed that he really didn't like her, and that caused her to not get really, you know, warmed up to him. And he really pushed the partial birth abortion bill during the election year when she was already dealing with the pension bond issue, and that energized the Right to Life folks, and who, as a consequence of that, were issuing little baseball cards. I don't know if you ever saw these during the campaign, the Whitman baby count every week, which was, I wanted her to sue them. She didn't, you know, that was, I guess, probably politically stupid to do, but I wanted her to sue them because it was false and they knew it, and that's libel. And I thought, you've got to smack these people, they're not going to stop. And they were following her around the campaign trail, and they were, you know, really ugly. And I remember there was a service at the cathedral in Newark with Archbishop McCarrick, and I think it was after the election or right around the election, and there were real concerns about security surrounding that event because of the vitriol that was surrounding her. And Archbishop McCarrick was a gem. I mean, he basically he came down off the altar and he said to the crowd, "Everyone's welcome in the house of God, and I don't want to hear any of this." And that ended whatever was going to happen. But it was that was libel, and that is another thing that has stuck with her. She was actually putting in place the first meaningful restrictions on abortion in New Jersey, and we still don't have any. So that tells you it was a phony issue. But
So how would you assess her administration as a whole?
I think the administration had a lot of integrity. I think we did a lot of good. You can sort of go across the spectrum of issues from, I think her environmental record, which I was involved with as Attorney General, really more so than the counsel's office. But, you know, Elliot Spitzer got most of the credit, but we were really behind a lot of the lawsuits against the Midwest power companies were our, you know, and I didn't begrudge him that. He was a New York AG, he had the New York Times, you know, and so whatever, it was the right thing to do, and she backed it completely, and that was not popular among some of the Republican establishment. The brownfields legislation that we did environmentally, Megan's Law, which I think struck a proper and appropriate balance between civil liberties and protecting the public against child predators. Really across the board, I think the deregulation of some utility work was something that was difficult to achieve in a responsible way, and I think we did that. I think fiscally we were responsible. I've explained my version of the pension bond issue, but she was able to show that the big challenge, what her administration was about, was can you be fiscally conservative and socially liberal? And I think she showed you could. I mean, welfare reform was another achievement of hers, and actually the reform that we achieved in New Jersey was less onerous than what Bill Clinton did in Washington. So I think it's open space preservation. You know, they're sort of coming to me as I'm talking, but these were auto insurance reform. All these things were major initiatives that she achieved, and she did it with integrity. She didn't have to compromise her values to achieve these things. So I don't think she's been given the credit that she deserves. She doesn't have. I can't account for it, actually. But some of it has to do with, you know, the legislature and that relationship never healed, really. And they talked to the press a lot more than she did. And so that all of politics in Trenton is about who, and probably everywhere, is who controls the narrative. What's the narrative about? And if you don't control that, which we never really did, we were never able to basically control the narrative. It was probably the most dynamic and engaged press corps that we'll ever have, more than any that we'll ever have again, I think. Because you go to the State House now, there's nobody, no reporters are there. That's, I couldn't leave my office without encountering 3 or 4 of them. That's gone. So we were never able to really control the narrative, and I think that's hurt her.
I also think, and certainly we've heard it from others who we've interviewed, is the fact that she left a year early to go to EPA, so her legacy was 1 year short of...
Yeah, that was a big discussion at the time. What would the effect be? And on the one hand, it's your last year and you're kind of a lame duck. And so I think that was what Mike Torpy believed. If you stay around this last year, what really are you going to be able to achieve? I don't think I really agree that was a mistake to go to the EPA. I think that she would have been a lame duck that year, and it would have been a lot of nonsense to deal with, frankly, because at that, if you go back to that time, I think Governor DeFrancesco was considering running for governor. I think Jack Collins was considering running for governor, and Bob Franks. The bad ideas that would have come at us, would have been awfully difficult to deal with. And something that the public doesn't understand is how much of the governor's job is stopping bad things from happening in the legislature, and not necessarily getting things affirmatively done, but it's just the things that they did do, the senior citizen property tax freeze, and all of these things that were really difficult as a matter of public policy, and that obviously the pension changes that were made that really has had, by themselves they would not have been that hurtful, but the fact that it created a $20 billion unfunded liability that then multiplied because nobody was making that payment, and now it's whatever, $100 billion. I mean, that kind of thing we would have had to try to stop, and it would have been a challenging year. I ended that year actually in litigation with the governor, which was over who gets to settle cases. So that tells you that would have been avoided. But there was a Medicare settlement that Governor DeFrancesco wanted me to reopen and zero out, and I wouldn't do it. And we got into a pretty bad 11th hour dispute over it and ended up in court, and the Attorney General won that one.
Interesting.
But that would have been avoided. But I don't think it was a mistake for her to leave. I think it was maybe not the greatest job in the Bush cabinet for her to get, but it would have been a difficult year.
Interesting. So you have continued to have an interesting and illustrious career since you served as Attorney General. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your role with the 9/11 Commission with Governor Kane, your role as Senior Advisor to General James Jones, and finally, last but not least, your role at Rutgers during the past few years.
So, yes, so Governor Kane, shortly after Governor Kane became the chair of the 9/11 Commission, I had actually gotten to know him. I didn't really know him in the 80s. I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't involved in all these things, but I got to know him through the Whitman administration. And I had taught his course a couple of times at Drew, and I actually had his class down to the AG's office to sort of explain what that department did. And so we had developed a relationship over the years. And I guess it was shortly after he was named the chair, he called and asked if I would be willing to assist. And initially it was a little bit difficult because there were no plans for a New York office, and would have involved going to Washington and sort of staying there during the weeks. And I really thought that my wife had sacrificed a lot, while I was Attorney General in terms of my time. And so initially sort of begged off it. But then he called, actually it wasn't not Governor Kane at that point, it was Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director, called and said, well, what would you say if we opened a New York office? And that made it more palatable, and I obviously wanted to do it. I mean, I had lived through that 9/11, and those were the longest 4 months of my life. There was 24/7. We didn't know what was going to happen next, and the anthrax attacks started, and of course they postmarked New Jersey, right? Where else could they have possibly come from? So it was very high tension, and I felt like government had really failed. At every level for something like that to happen. And I really wanted to know why and what happened. And so bottom line is I agreed to come on, and I was put in charge of a team that was responsible for sort of reconstructing the day of 9/11, who was doing what when, from President Bush down to the firefighters in New York. And it was a very compressed time period for the investigation, and we had limited staff and a limited budget, but they were great people, and we had some homicide detectives from New York. We had John Azzarello, who I knew from the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, whose wife had lost both of her brothers. They worked for Kane Fitzgerald. And really some outstanding investigators, and it was I would say 3/4 of the way through it, I told Beth that I think this is the biggest mistake of my life because I didn't see how it was going to come together. But I have to say, Governor Kane did a phenomenal job. I mean, he let people run. It was all partisan. They were all partisan people, all 10 of them, and he let them go, and he let them say their things, and he let them be in the press, and he let them, he let that happen. And in doing so, he built up tremendous credibility with them. He wasn't trying to, rule them with an iron fist. And at the right moment, he and Lee Hamilton basically said, "Okay, this has to stop. We have to have an agreement on what this says, and it's got to be objective. We're not using value-laden language. We're going to just say these are the facts." And it was tremendous. At the end of the day, we wrote the report in 3 weeks. I mean, and it was it turned out to be a tremendous experience, and I learned a lot about leadership from watching Governor Kane at work. In that he has very good touch with people. He can disagree with them, and they will respect him, and that's a hard thing to pull off, especially in a partisan atmosphere like that. So that was a tremendous experience, and then as a consequence, as an outgrowth of that, I got to know people in Washington who who are involved in everything. And one of the people I got to know was involved with General Jones, who had been Commandant of the Marine Corps and the Chief Allied Commander in NATO, and had been appointed by President Bush as the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security. And one of the projects they were going to undertake was to try to sort of change the approach a little bit in the dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians. And what we were involved, the reason I was called on was that some of it would try to develop a responsible law enforcement presence in the West Bank. And that was about an 8-month period. I spent a lot of time in Jerusalem and in the West Bank and Ramallah. And the first 2 months were, I thought, what are we doing here? Because they couldn't even agree on where to meet, let alone on, so both sides had to give. The Israelis had to agree to withdraw from certain towns and let the Palestinians run law enforcement and the courts. And the Palestinians had to agree on which towns and on allowing the Israelis, the IDF, to basically screen everybody who was going to be a prosecutor or a policeman. And initially, neither wanted to give anything. But what's amazing is they said, no, there was no gradual part of this. It was no until it was yes. And then suddenly it was yes, and we did. Jenin was one town, which was a very sensitive town for the Israelis because a lot of the suicide bombers in Jerusalem had come from that town. They obviously watched it like a hawk, but they let this happen. And the Jordanians were tremendously helpful in allowing us to basically train the Palestinian police at their facilities, and a lot of cooperation between the Jordanians and Israelis, much more than I would have guessed. But I guess now it's pretty common knowledge that they've cooperated, and it was a tremendous experience. And the pilot was a success, and the second town, which there was a big debate at the second town. The Israelis wanted Hebron, and the Palestinians said no way, because there's a Jewish settlement going right through the middle of town in Hebron, and the Palestinians wanted Bethlehem, and the Israelis said that's too close to Jerusalem. We can't do that. But they ascended. I forget which town they settled on, but that was a success too. But something that the Israeli IDF commander told us when we started came true, which is, he said, okay, this is your thing, and this is Bush's, last year or last years, and it doesn't matter if it works because there'll be a new administration, they'll have their own idea. And he said, if the Democrats win, they're going to parachute in a rock star, and that's going to how they're going to, and we're going to have to deal with that. And if the Republicans win, it's going to be the Republicans, but not their idea. And that's what happened. I mean, they made progress. They're still sort of doing it, but it didn't have the emphasis that General Jones had put on it. His conviction was that you have to solve the ground level things first. And if you work at the ground level, people realize they have a stake in their security. Some of these issues don't seem as big anymore. And I think he's right. But it hasn't really been tried.
Very difficult. Yeah, interesting. And I don't know if I've left anything out, but then you came to Rutgers.
Yeah, in the interim, I had joined a law firm, Kirkpatrick and Lockhart. It was called Kane Gates, and then left with a partner of mine. We started our own firm, and that's probably the happiest I've been in law. Actually, was a small firm, and you know what that's like. You're your own boss, and there's something liberating about that. You know, if you don't make money, it's because you didn't make money, not because somebody else let you down. But then Rutgers, the law school dean, had decided to leave, and I got a call late at night from some friends who were Rutgers law alums asking me if I would put my hat in the ring to be dean of Rutgers Law School, which I had been teaching there as an adjunct, but really had not, again, the accidental career, I had not really thought about academia as a route. And ultimately, you know, agreed to do it to sort of carry a message they wanted to send to the university about the law school being more relevant to New Jersey and being more engaged in the life of the law in New Jersey. And as the process went on, and to my surprise, I kept surviving, learned more and more about the school. And it's one of those things where suddenly you realize, I remember saying to Beth, you know, now I kind of want this thing. You know, watch me not get it. But they did offer it to me, and at the last 5 years, I've been a dean of the law school, and then a year and a half ago, when Rutgers was in trouble with the athletics situation, and also with the pending merger of UMD&J into Rutgers, President Barshmi asked me to be the general counsel, and so I did that. I did not want to do that, I have to say. I feel like I've sort of done that as AG. It's a very similar kind of job. But I got a good financial deal for the law school out of it, and I was able to help Rutgers, and you know, and it was a crazy time, and a lot of things happened. But the bottom line is the merger with UMD&J got done. You know, we're now in the Big Ten. It's a very historic time for this university, and I was happy to be a part of it, and now I'm even happier to be a university professor on sabbatical and able to work on things.
That's great, and now housed at Eagleton Institute of Politics, which is great.
Which is great, and it's a tremendous setting, tremendous people. I was counsel to Alan Rosenthal when he did the redistricting, legislative redistricting. Right. Got to know him really well, and a tremendous guy, and it's just an honor to be occupying his space here. Really one of the great people in New Jersey politics over the years, and this place is really the monument that he helped to build. So happy to be here.
So, is there anything else about the Whitman administration that you would like to add that I might not have asked you?
I think we've covered it. I mean, it was a. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not grateful to Governor Whitman for all kinds of things, but my career, my wife. I met my wife. If I had not made that move, I might not have met Beth, and turned my life around. And she is a person of tremendous integrity and courage, and has paid a price for it. And I hope someday that's recognized more broadly than it is now.
So I think this is a good time to stop. This has been a delightful conversation, and I thank you very much, John.
Thank you. I appreciate it.